Linguistics Behind the Scenes.
What you always wanted to know about language and how to explore it.
With Christina Sanchez-Stockhammer
and Dominic Piazza. Hey Christina, it's good to be back.
Here we are, back again.
Christina, what's in a name? That which we call a rose by any other name would smell as sweet.
Ooh, Shakespeare, I love that. Yeah. I mean, he's right, isn't he? Shakespeare as a linguist, because what he's telling us is that the form that we use in order to refer to something, to some object, is not necessarily related to the content. I really love that quote. I actually use it in my lectures sometimes.
Oh, yeah. Shakespeare was a man of many talents. He wore many hats. It's particularly impressive considering I think he had quite a humble background as a person. But, you know, he makes a very good point that the words we use to describe things, sure, you can trace back their etymology. You can go all the way back to Latin, to Greek, to Proto-Indo-European and these early languages. But ultimately, why we use a certain sound to describe something was an arbitrary decision that some early humans made at some point.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Earlier or later in the process. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and why? Well, yeah, we don't really know. Some people think it might be imitative. Maybe that's for some words, but we don't really know. And this is kind of at this nexus of linguistics and archaeology that when you go back far enough, well, there's a lack of written history. There's a lot we don't know about what people used to be called, what they used to call things. We just have to guess.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, it's really difficult to know how exactly people might have used language in the very, very distant past. But we can be quite confident that they did use language because they achieved quite a lot of things already, at least the remains that we see, cave paintings, or also, for example, that they managed to go by boat to certain islands, which tells us that there must have been some kind of joint effort among humans. And in order to coordinate that, you need language. So we can assume that language has been around for quite a while.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. That, we humans, we are social creatures. Actually, our ability to organize ourselves and work together socially, I would say really is our strength, right? We are more powerful and capable together than any one individual is. And certainly, I don't think we're made to fight each other. Our teeth aren't very sharp. Our nails aren't very sharp. We have to create weapons in order to fight each other because we don't have any real natural weapons. So clearly, humans must have been communicating for a long time. And the parts of the brain that deal with speech are very crucial.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. I mean, speech really is something that characterizes humans. It's something which you only find in humans in this degree of complexity. I mean, you have communication among animals too. But if you think about human speech, I mean, we can talk about what happened in the past. We can talk about what we think might happen in the future or in places that are far away. And we can even make up stories. And all of that, of course, is quite special. So we're not restricted to the here and now. So language gives us wings to fly away.
Oh, that's beautiful. That's beautiful. Yeah, the debate, is animal communication language? In my experience, linguistic students really like that question and they really like to talk about it. Some of them are very passionate in arguing that animal communication is language. But nevertheless, we can all agree that for humans and animals, communication in one form or another is very, very critical.
Yeah, definitely. Communication is so important. And I mean, that's also very important among animals. I mean, they also have their cries for warning each other and also for mating and all kinds of things. But of course, if we think about humans, I mean, there's a few things that we do with language that are quite special. So, for example, we use language a lot to establish social links between people, which is something very nice. So that's what I really like about language. And as a linguist, there's something that we can also do with language, and that is use language to talk about language. So it's self-referential. That's really very special too.
Yes, in modern parlance, we might say it's meta, very meta. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and certainly something that's really human about language and communication is that we humans, we give each other names. Maybe animals do it too, but certainly I can't understand it if they do. But we humans very explicitly give each other names, and it's critical to our identity, to our history, to our society, to our culture. Names are really everything. And so, yeah, I think we can reasonably assume that early humans probably had names too.
I would think so in any case. I mean, if you think about how important names are for, what you just said, for identity formation and to know who you are referring to in a group. For that reason, I mean, I would say we have good reason to assume that also in prehistory, people already used some kind of names or some way of referring to individuals. But we can't tell because we don't have any writing from that time. For that reason, we have to do what we very often do when we think about the past. We assume that things that are true at the moment, that we observe in present times, that they have always been the case. And of course, sometimes that's quite dangerous because a lot of the traditions that you would believe have been around for centuries and things like that actually are far more recent once you start doing research about them. But something like names, I would actually expect that to be very, very old already, indeed.
Yeah, certainly they must have had names in some form or some kind of unique identifier for calling each other, I would think. It's almost impossible to organize your society without that because you have to be able to tell each other apart. But, that's kind of the problem when we're finding old early human remains from, my gosh, not just thousands of years ago, but maybe hundreds of thousands of years ago, maybe millions of years ago. We don't know what they were called. We don't know what they were named. We don't have any records for that. So, Christina, how does that work in archaeology when they find human remains?
Well, when archaeologists find human remains from the past, sometimes they have some kind of information about the name. For example, in ancient Egypt, you might find a mummy with some indication of the name. But in Europe, very often you will find human remains in places where you don't have any inscriptions. And at the time, they weren't really using writing yet. So there is no way of knowing what their names were.
Oh, yeah. I mean, you would probably only be able to identify remains if they were the remains of royalty or perhaps someone really famous. So, yeah, like Egyptian pharaohs, that would make sense. But everybody else, it's probably not recorded in history. And especially if it's prehistory, nothing is recorded at all because there is no writing. So what do you do in that case?
What archaeologists usually do then is that they just use some kind of ID, which is based on the place where they found the human remains. So, for example, Haunstetten, Unterer Talweg, grave 34, number 2. So Haunstetten would be the place name. Unterer Talweg, that would be the road where it was found. And then you get the grave and the number of the individual skeleton. And that will be the name, quote unquote. That's all that is traditionally used to identify the different skeletons and other humans' remains. Okay,
so there's a formula. It sounds like there is a formula here for assembling, for creating these names.
Yeah, a formula, but then what do you get? You get a number, basically. And that's the thing. I mean, we talked so much about names being something that is so important for human identity. And here we have numbers to talk about people. And of course, this is something that dehumanizes them. Now, of course, one could argue that to a certain extent, prehistorical human remains aren't people in the strictest sense anymore, that they are objects. But then the question is, do you want to argue like that? The law in Germany, in any case, would argue like that. But then, of course, here we're still talking about someone who lived in the past, and I have to say, I don't like the idea of just using numbers to talk about people.
Oh, yeah. And when it comes to giving numbers to people instead of names? Well, something we learned from Abba Naor, who is a Holocaust survivor. We spoke about him on a previous episode. He goes around and talks about his experiences during the Holocaust. And I think it's well known that the Nazis would assign numbers to the Jewish inmates in the concentration camps. And that was a deliberate effort to dehumanize them. And unfortunately, I think it's very effective. So yeah, if we can avoid that, it would be nice with these human remains. Maybe not to refer to them with numbers, but to refer to them with something a little bit more humanizing and personifying.
Yeah, that's what I also thought. And that's what two archaeologists also thought that I cooperated with in a project in which we carried out research about exactly that question, namely Philipp Stockhammer and Kerstin Hofmann. And what we wanted to find out was whether it would be a good idea to give names to archaeological human remains, in addition to those IDs, which are, of course, necessary for archaeologists because they have to store the bones somewhere. They have to be able to refer to them in a systematic way. So I completely understand why archaeologists would like to have such a system, but we all felt that it would be a very interesting question to ask. So is it a good idea to give names in addition to that, or maybe not, because there are also some problems that are attached to that?
Oh, yeah. Well, hey, we modern humans are the same, aren't we? We all have names, but then I think we all have a national ID number, don't we? Which is used for identifying us in a system, in a database where you have to organize and catalog. So yeah, it makes sense to have a numerical identifier alongside your name. So I totally get that. So wow, you actually worked on this. You actually worked on kind of this convergence of linguistics and archaeology. So how did you go about this? What challenges did you encounter?
We thought it would be a good idea to do a survey to just ask the general population or general audience, but also some archaeologists and some linguists, how they feel about this topic. Because on the one hand, of course, we might want to use names because names have a lot of advantages, but then there's also some problems. So if we give names to remains from the past, we kind of make them our owners in a certain way. So who's got the right to name those human remains, because people used to have a name in the past. So is it okay to give them yet another name? There's quite a lot of things that we wanted to find out, how people felt about that. And so we did a survey and we sent it out to everyone we knew. So we just tried to spread it as widely as possible. But in the end, it was still amazing because we had exactly the same number of archaeologists and linguists, namely 99 each. And then we had a roughly similar share of people who are neither of these, which is very nice because that way you get three different perspectives on this same question. One from specialists from archaeology, the other one from specialists in the field of naming, so to speak, and the other one from a general audience.
Oh, wow. That sounds very interdisciplinary. Oh, that's how I like it. Nothing exists in isolation. It's good to kind of harmonize our different viewpoints and our different expertise.
Yeah, definitely. And I have to say, in that survey, we were very grateful that so many different people participated. Altogether, it was over 400 people, 462 even, who started filling in the questionnaire. And in the end, 319 completed it. And I have to say, I'm so grateful to all those people because the questionnaire contains a lot of questions that are really, really boring to answer, and I'll tell you more in a moment why. But so I'm very glad that they went through this, and at the same time, of course, this also means that they cared about that question, and that was very nice. And so we noticed that this is really a question that people had very strong feelings about, and in the replies that we got, some of them were highly emotional. So that was a very interesting experience across the boundaries of archaeology and linguistics.
Okay, very nice. And so you had a very successful survey, it sounds like. So how did people respond? What did they say?
It was very interesting because when we asked them if they liked the current system, the majority, so 65%, actually said they were happy with the current system. But then in another question, we asked them if they thought it would be a good idea to give additional names. And 68% replied, yes, that would be a good idea. And we asked them, would that be problematic or unproblematic? And 66% said it would be unproblematic. So on the one hand, they said it's fine as it is. But on the other hand, they said, oh, yeah, we think it's a good idea to change it.
Oh, no.
This really makes it a bit difficult in that sense. So we can say there's no clear mandate in one direction or the other.
Oh, yeah. Oh, it's a coin flip.
Yeah. And the interesting thing, by the way, was that the archaeologists were a bit more skeptical than the average, which makes sense because they would be the ones who would have to implement the changes in a system that they already know. Whereas the linguists were clearly more enthusiastic than the average because linguists like names and creating words and things like that. So obviously there was a bias there too. But altogether, if you throw it all together, well, that's the result that we got. So it was not very clear. But so the question, should we give the bones a name? Well, it's a kind of, would be nice, but not absolutely clear. And then we also wanted to know about the next step, namely, if we do that, how can we go about it? How can we give them a name? What would you do? I mean, if you found human remains, if you were responsible for giving them a name, Dominic, what would you possibly do?
Oh, yeah. Well, I mean, first and foremost, I might try to identify whether the remains are male or female. I think that's something archaeologists typically do, although as I understand, it's not always obvious, especially considering the condition of the remains, how much you have available, what you know about the people from that time period and what have you. Then, well, the easiest naming scheme would just be to name it the first thing that comes to mind. But that could quickly become a problem, right? Because there might be a researcher in another part of the world who may have discovered something and they just so happen to coincidentally give it the exact same name. And now we have a duplicate. We have two archaeological remains with the same name. That would create confusion. So I would probably want something more systematic and more formulaic so that it allows me to kind of coordinate with researchers around the world so that we're not naming things the same thing and creating confusion.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's an interesting idea. Though, of course, with these ID numbers, you would have exactly that. So even if you had two remains that have exactly the same name, then still you could identify which is which based on their ID number. But of course. Mm-hmm. But of course, other things, I mean, might also be problematic. I mean, if you say you just pick a name that comes to mind, most likely it's a modern name. Mm-hmm. So it could, for example, be a name like Christina. And the question is, would you want to do that? And obviously no, because I mean, it's, inside the name, you can see there's certain meaning parts, like the meaning of Christian, which the name is based on, which occurred after that person lived. So it would be very strange somehow to do that, I suppose. And the same thing if you used, for example, other names that might have certain ethnical associations, it's difficult. So if we use names that are used in the present, then we will carry over the associations of those names to the past. And that's why we thought it would be a good idea to create a naming scheme that would allow archaeologists to avoid exactly that.
That's true. It would be anachronistic. Naturally, it would be anachronistic if you give it a modern name. Although it can certainly be recognizable to me just as kind of an outsider to the field of archaeology. I'm very familiar with the early human remains of Lucy, although I actually don't think she was a human. She was a proto-human, an ancestor to a human. Mm-hmm. And I'm very familiar with that. It's just always stuck in my memory. I probably learned about it in school at some point as a child. And I believe that name derived from, I think the researchers were very much enjoying the Beatles song Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds. Either it was popular at the time or they just so happened to enjoy it. But yeah, that is a modern name being applied to human remains from 3 million years ago.
Yeah, Lucy is such a famous case, definitely. definitely. Another very, very famous human find is Ötzi. So that's also a name that many people know in Germany, but possibly also in the whole world. Do you know Ötzi, the Iceman?
The Iceman, yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, that's how he was first referred to. So it's a male mummy that was found in a glacier in the Ötztaler Alpen, so in the Alps, in 1991. And so what they did, or what actually one person, one reader of a newspaper actually suggested, is that he should be called Ötzi. So using the first syllable of the place, the Ötztaler Alps, and then adding the E in the end, which is a kind of endearing suffix. And the interesting thing is that this was very quickly adopted. So in the beginning, the newspapers, for example, talked about the dead body, the find, the Iceman. And the interesting thing is that then they started to talk about Ötzi. And once they did that, actually, they talked more about the human behind those bones. They were more interested in the narrative and less so in the, let's say, more physical aspects of the objects that they found on the glacier, so to speak. And I think that's very interesting. So once we have a name, we think more about the person behind it.
Oh, yeah. Well, it's really interesting to hear that Ötzi was a formulaic creation, because it kind of sounds like it could be a name. Sounds like it would be a name, maybe from that part of the world, perhaps. And you're absolutely right. When you personify them with this name, it has a really strong effect. Like, yeah, when I think of Lucy, she's almost like a celebrity. Well, when in reality, I think she was just one of many, right? But
exactly.
Yeah, you're absolutely right.
And I mean, if you say that Ötzi to you sounds like a name, that's exactly what we thought as well. I mean, Ötzi, people have known that. It's a kind of pattern that seems to be quite common. So actually, with newer finds, this pattern was also used. So there's also Ardi, there's Birdie, there's Ipsi, there's Kilty. So in many different places, when human remains were found, actually, or proto-human remains, what was done actually is that people used the first syllable of the place name and then an E in the end. And that was basically the expression, the name that was used to refer to that human who lived there a long time ago.
Yeah, wow, how cool. How cool. Well, I think it works. It sounds like a good naming scheme to me.
It is, but on the other hand, it's also a bit problematic because, of course, Ötzi is unique. So it could also be a bit like a trade name. So in a certain way, you're kind of distancing yourself as well from that person, that human who lived. And of course, if you think about the E in the end, I mean, that's a kind of suffix that you use to express endearment. And this is something that the participants of our study were very critical about. So we had a lot of people said, oh, it's not okay to use that because you don't know each other well. At least someone like Ötzi, they don't know you, so you have no right to use some markers of familiarity that you would otherwise use with friends, with people you know very well.
I see. Yeah. Well. First of all, how you said the name is unique. It's interesting how when it comes to names, we have kind of a stock of names in every language. We have a stock of names that are considered like established names and they're acceptable. And then if you try to innovate or create a new name, socially, sometimes you might face a stigma, right? You might face pushback, like, oh my gosh, like that's what do you think? That's a made up name. What were the parents thinking? Oh, they're trying to make the child special by giving them a completely unique name to make them stand out. But this idea of a made up name is really kind of funny because if we really think about it, all names are made up or they were made up at some point in time. It's just that enough time passed, enough people had that name that it became acceptable. So I definitely hear what you're saying there. And yeah, with the E ending to make it endearing, we do have a lot of names, nicknames, Bobby, Joey. With animals, you have a doggy or a kitty. It does make it very endearing. You're right. But I'm not necessarily sure if it's a problem.
No, I don't think it's necessarily a problem, but it's something we wanted to test. I mean, to what extent is that the best way of producing a name? And in addition, I mean, if you think about it, if you have various finds in the same place, you could still just create one name because you just have one suffix that you could add in the end. And so what we actually wanted to try out is whether it would also be possible to create more names, but in a way that is slightly similar, because usually it's a good idea to try and keep things similar to what has been done before, because then the system becomes more acceptable. And so this Ötzi naming system seems to be almost automatic. When you have new finds somewhere, this is what archaeologists will do. And so what we did is we tried out whether it's a good idea to use the or some element, usually the first syllable, from the place name where the human remains were found, and then combine that with different affixes, with different endings that are used to create names in German.
Yeah, I hear what you're saying. If you're trying to establish a new norm, then you want to be consistent about it. But so give me some examples. What were some of the examples you came up with for these names?
The interesting thing is that in German, it's possible to see that names end in particular ways. And that is because historically, that is an ending that was attached. So there's a kind of word formation. And we use that by just using those final parts and attaching them to the first syllable of the place name. And that's how, for the name Hauenstetten, you get Haun, and then we created new names like Hauna, Hauner, Haunle, Haunsa, or Haunwin. And that gave us a long list of different names, potential names for human remains from the past.
Yeah, nice. That's compelling. I mean, I'm kind of an outsider here, but those sound like real names to me. What did other people think?
The interesting thing is that in our survey, people also thought so. So we had 35 names altogether, and out of these, 27 were rated as possible names for humans. And the interesting thing is that quite a lot of these also received the highest possible rating in terms of sounds like a familiar name. I don't know this, but I think it sounds familiar somehow. And I mean, this really encouraged us to say, okay, well, apparently these names could be used because they fulfill the criterion of sounding like a human name. But at the same time, what you mentioned, namely that you need to make sure that it's the correct sex, for example, we also tested that. I'm not sure what it's like in English, but in German, in any case, it's very often possible to guess a person's gender from their name ending. Is that the same in English?
Oh, maybe there are some of them. Yeah. It's if it ends in an A, then it's probably a feminine name like Alexandra or Roberta or something along those lines. Or Anna, things like that. And we also have that in German. So the A ending, I mean, that would be the most typical one for females. But actually, that also corresponds to other vowels. So usually when you have a German name that ends in a vowel, then it tends to be female. And when you have a German name that ends in a consonant, it tends to be male. And that's quite interesting because we wanted to see whether people also perceived it like that, and also what to do in those cases where, for some reason or another, you didn't want to pick any of those two categories. And so we also asked people to rate whether they felt that the name was rather for all genders or appropriate for males only or only for females. And they had to do the same thing with those 35 names. Oh,
That's
wow.
why I think they had a tough time, because we repeatedly asked them questions about all those names and they had to indicate that.
Oh, names. Yeah, it's interesting with the sort of customary distinctions between male and female names. It's often you have to have a very firm grasp of the culture or the language for it to occur to you intuitively. So for example, one time I had a Japanese friend and I showed her maybe the 100 most common male and female names in English. And I asked her, guess which gender this name is. Guess if it's usually a male or a female name. And in general, unless she could remember a figure or a person she knew who had that name, in general, she couldn't really reliably guess which gender the name was. And that's okay because, hey, if I was looking at Japanese names and I had to guess the gender, in most cases, I probably would not be able to reliably know which one is which, but a native speaker would naturally know what sounds like what. So how did it go in this study? How did it go with that?
Yeah, exactly as expected. So most of the participants were native speakers. And so they also classified the names according to the system that they know intuitively without being aware of it. And in spite of the fact that we had this neutral option where we said, okay, this is a good name for all genders, in 3/4 of the names, there were gender-specific associations, which means that obviously when you use such a newly created name, it's important to keep that in mind as well.
Okay, wow. So this whole thing is a lot more complicated than I thought. But I really admire the attention to detail here. And so kind of the core where we kind of started with this was kind of the level of respect that we pay to these human remains, whether it's considered respectful or rude to give it a name at all, to give it a specific type of name and things like that. So how did that dimension play into it? How did people kind of regard the politeness or rudeness of these different names?
Yeah, that's a really, really good question. And that's one that I was also particularly interested in. And so the question is, how do you test this respectfulness? So what we did is we thought that age could be a good stand-in for that. Because if you think about how you as an adult usually talk to other adults or to children, we thought it might be a good idea to ask people, is this a name that you would use for adults and children? Or for adults only, or for children only? And that way we hope to get an idea of whether people assumed that, some would be more respectful than others. And it turns out that this actually worked very well because there were 3 names that were rated as, these are really just good names for children. And these were Haunchen, Haunlein, and Haunichen, and all of them diminutives. And in addition, I mentioned Hauni earlier, and some people really got highly emotional about saying, okay, this is disrespectful. And we actually found that here people were very divided between 2 views. So slightly more than half of all participants said it's appropriate for all ages. And 47% said it's only for children. So for that reason, it's not entirely clear. And the interesting thing is that in the end, we asked people to also tell us what their favorite name was. And many of them said, it's Hauni. So it seems to be a kind of love-hate relationship. So this pattern of Ötzi seems to be very, very strong in people. So it was a very clear winner in spite of the fact that it's problematic.
Yeah, how funny is that? That from the outset, people did not really like these kind of more diminutive and endearing names, but then in the end, they kind of demonstrated a preference for it. It's a bit contradictory, but quite funny. And it reminds me almost in a way, of pet names. And when I say pet names, I mean the actual names for our pets, although pet names are also names we can give each other as people, and how typically we give our pets funny names, endearing names, names that you wouldn't give a person, but you can give your pets human names. And I find it immensely funny because it just sounds so serious. I need to go home and feed Robert, or I need to take Elizabeth for a walk. It just sounds so extremely funny to give them these very serious human names. And you know what? It really personifies them in a way.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. It emphasizes that they're individuals and that they have a personality. So that's absolutely right.
Yeah, a personality. Got the word person in it. Not only people can have personalities.
Yeah, yeah, and I mean, with regard to the human bones, to the human remains, of course, this is very important because, of course, in the past they were living beings, but now they are. There's just the bones left, basically. And so I think this is also a very interesting aspect. And I think that's also why our naming system is quite good, because we have a combination in our minds, on the one hand, of Ötzi as someone who tried to cross the Alps but then died, and at the same time of a mummy lying in a glass case in a museum. And also that idea of a reconstruction. So it's these different levels. So and that's why I think our names are quite good, because they combine the non-human place name with elements of human names. And so it's a kind of conceptual blending.
Yeah, I like that a lot, because when it comes to these old remains, often they are so extremely old that, it's you might just see it as a collection of bones, and you might forget that it really was a living person, a living being at one point. And so whatever we can do to humanize them or to restore some of that quality by giving them a real name, I think that's a worthwhile endeavor.
Definitely, particularly since the latest methods in archaeology allow us to find out so much more about humans from the past.
Ooh.
Yeah, for example, we know what teeth form at what age. And so based on where you live, the plants will grow in the earth, and the minerals from the earth will enter your body through the plants or through the drinking water, and then they get stored inside your teeth, and then archaeologists can see whether you moved from one place to another one during the childhood and the early teens when the different teeth formed, which is quite exciting. Or, for example, it's possible now to carry out genetic analyses, and these help us see the family relations between different skeletons from the same region. So there's a lot of information now which makes the humans from the past re-emerge as personalities in their own right. And to talk about them properly, of course, we need names somehow, and that's, what we hope to provide with our study.
Yeah, unlocking their secrets. Oh my goodness. This is brilliant, fascinating work. Things like these, it's why I have so much respect for archaeologists and the other types of researchers who deal with this, because to be able to analyze these things and then draw these different conclusions based on the available evidence, which is often very old and not always in perfect condition, I think is very impressive. When it comes to names, my understanding is that, what we might call family names, or in British English, they might call surnames. In American English, we call it a last name. As I understand it, for a lot of history, the only people afforded family names were royalty or aristocracy. And they weren't really afforded to the masses until things became a bit more egalitarian. In the time before we really had established family names, I think people usually would use the place they're from, right? I mean, the best example is Leonardo da Vinci. To the uninitiated, they might think his family name is Da Vinci. Why wouldn't you? But if you actually know the origins of that, you know that it just means from Vinci. It's Leonardo from Vinci. That's the place he was from. In a way, that means he didn't really have a family name. Right? Not really. It would be like Dominic of America or Christina of Germany, right? It's used to differentiate you, but it's not really a unique family name. So this idea of using the place as the name is not completely foreign.
Yeah. That's also the reason why we thought it would be such a good idea to use the place names, because there is tradition also in German to derive surnames, family names from place names. For example, if someone comes from Altenburg, you would call them Altenburger, and that's a family name that still exists. So there's also different family names still around in Germany that work like that. So it's a very natural thing to do.
Yeah, and these words describing a person and where they're from, they're called demonyms. Think of demo like demographics. Demography describes people. and places. And probably a favorite would be a person from the city of Hamburg in Germany is a hamburger. That is not a coincidence. That is not. I believe they say it was maybe German migrants in the United States, probably who hailed from Hamburg, who invented the sandwich with meat between the buns. But I don't think people immediately know that it's connected to Hamburg. And then, of course, you get creations like a cheeseburger, which is fantastic. And so, I actually have a friend from Hamburg. He says he is a professional hamburger.
Oh, that's really, really sweet. Yeah, so places are really important in establishing identity. And I think that's why it's also a good idea to use that for the creation of these names for the historical human remains. And if you think about it, what kind of meaning would you like to give the name, the invented name, the newly created name for prehistoric human remains? How much do we know about those people that might also have been relevant to them somehow? And if you think about that, then you will notice that the place where we found them will definitely have been relevant because it's where they died. Probably they also lived there, but in any case, they have an important relation to that place. And for that reason, I think that makes sense. So if my body was found in a very distant future and people had to make up a name for me, I suppose it would be okay if it was the place name plus an ending that expresses that I'm a human because it's a human name ending. So I think this is a respectful way of trying to go about the creation of such individual, such unique names for humans. And that's why I really like the place names.
Christina, yeah, you're right. When I think about that is, you might not know my name, but you at least know where I'm from. And where I was from was an important part of my identity. So I don't mind that. I don't mind with being called by where I'm from. So yeah, I suppose in the absence of knowing the actual name of the person, yeah, it's not a bad alternative.
Absolutely.
Yeah, wow, Christina, today's discussion was incredibly thought-provoking. I mean, names and identity, archaeology, human remains, history, what's in a name, as we started with. I mean, yeah, totally captivating and enlightening. I really enjoyed it.
Yeah, absolutely. And it shows you how wide linguistics is. I mean, in applied linguistics, we don't just help improve dictionaries. We don't just get ideas of what can be done in teaching language. But here, in the interaction with archaeologists, we actually tried to provide some system that can hopefully help people in the future when they want to select names for human remains.
Yeah, dispelling maybe myths about what linguistics is and what linguists do. That's what we're all about.
Exactly. So stay curious, have fun with language.
And join us next time on Linguistics Behind the Scenes.